Laura works for Americans for Peace Now, and she is their government relations person, so she...
And Director of Policy.
And Director of...
Policy.
And Director of Policy. So she spends a great deal of time on the Hill, and we work very closely with her in exchanging information about various offices. We have good access to different offices, and we like to keep that information together. One of our colleagues is taking a vacation right now from the Arab American Institute, but she's often involved in our collaborative discussions and planning too. Laura publishes a weekly roundup the end of most weeks about what's happened in Congress, and if you want to get this email, you can go on to the APN website and access that on the website. Laura brings experience not only from the Israeli peace community, but very important experience from her time of service in the Foreign Service, in which she spent a considerable amount of time in Jerusalem as well as in many other countries. It's a pleasure to have Lara here, and as part of her job, she also has a little side job here with a group called Iramin, and this is an Israeli group. You may have heard of Danny Seidemann. He's often quoted in the New York Times, and this is an organization that is specifically focused on Israeli Jewish organization, specifically focused on Jerusalem, and shares our perspective that for the best interests of Israelis and the best interests of Palestinians, Jerusalem needs to be shared. Thank you, Lara.
Thank you, Corinne. It is a pleasure to be here. It is a pleasure to be able to do something for Churches for Middle East Peace and with Churches for Middle East Peace. We work very closely together. Corinne has not stressed, I think, sufficiently how much help they give me in my efforts on the Hill and in Washington. Tremendous advocates for peace. I'm mic'd, but only for that, I'm sorry. No, the Church for Middle East Peace is a tremendous advocate for a peaceful two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I feel very fortunate to have them and all of their supporters as allies in this effort. Thank you for inviting me and letting me be part of this. I want to acknowledge, as I start, Danny Seidemann, who is not actually in the room, but is sort of inside my head, because really Danny is the person who knows more about Jerusalem and Jerusalem issues than anyone in the world. And he and I had a long conversation yesterday about really what we should talk about. This isn't my normal topic of presentation for Jerusalem. I normally would come in here and talk to you about settlements and roads and other threats to sharing Jerusalem. Corinne wants me to talk more about the Jewish-Israeli connection. So I actually have a whole section here of notes on the barrier and settlements and whatnot. So during the Q&A, if people want to get into that, I can. But I'm going to focus more on what the topic is. This is, first, I know you've already had a presentation on this. I brought a map, so if people want to look, and I'll try not to point to it a great deal, particularly because I'm at an odd angle and can't really see it. We're talking about Jerusalem, Greater Jerusalem, an area about 600,000 Israelis, 600,000 Palestinians total. In East Jerusalem, since 67, years of settlement policy, we now have pretty much population parity between Jews and Palestinians in East Jerusalem. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about two very closely intertwined populations these days. And virtually no Palestinian presence in West Jerusalem. Yes?
Just start out, can you outline on the map what you mean by Greater Jerusalem?
Greater Jerusalem, this is West Jerusalem here. The area inside the dark red line are the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem. This is all East Jerusalem. And then Greater Jerusalem would also encompass the neighborhoods, for instance, Ma'ale Adumim, coming down here to some of the settlements. There are some Israelis who would come all the way down here and consider this part of Greater Jerusalem, but we're largely talking about sort of this area, not Bethlehem, but we're talking East Jerusalem and the immediate settlement hinterland. These are not technical terms. Greater Jerusalem means different things to different people. In terms of the Jewish connection to Jerusalem, and this is probably something that you all, as people of faith or people who've been focused on faith, know. The Jewish connection to Jerusalem is profound. Next year in Jerusalem, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem. The reunification of Jerusalem in 67 is a watershed, not just for Israelis, but for Jews everywhere. For those of us who are born after the reunification of Jerusalem, it is something that has been raised to that sort of mythological level. The images of Jews being able to enter the old city. The Israeli connection to Jerusalem is equally profound. I talked to Danny about this a great deal last night. Zionism is essentially a secular movement, but its roots are in the religious texts, the religious sources. That's where Zionism gains its legitimacy, and Jerusalem is a fundamental part of this. The sites in Jerusalem have an iconic value for Jews all over the world. So the starting point for any, if you're talking to about Jews or with Israelis, is to recognize this. This is profound, it is real, it is not a card that's taken out at a negotiating table, it is absolutely real, and it's something that for all of us in the peace camp, even the most secular among us, you have to recognize this, you have to respect it, you have to honor this. Jerusalem is unlike any other place. It is a place, I was thinking about this last night. I've used this line before, Jerusalem is unlike any other place, and I challenged myself to see if it's true. And it is. This is a place, and I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, have been there, 3 religious narratives coexisting, Jewish, Muslim, Christian. You have 2 national narratives coexisting, Israeli, Palestinian. Jews and Israelis would not be who they are without Jerusalem. Christians, Muslims would not be who they are without Jerusalem. This is fundamental to the identity of all of these people. It is, as I was writing this, I was thinking there's something, every few years we see resolutions introduced in Congress, or there's these viral emails that circulate on the internet that I see that people send me, making the argument, well, Judaism has made Jerusalem the focus of our faith for 3,000 years, and it's hardly mentioned at all in the Quran, so therefore we win. And I always think, this is lunacy. It's no less lunacy when we're in the course of negotiations and a Palestinian or Muslim leader suggests that the Jewish connection to Jerusalem is not legitimate. And this is a kind of lunacy that is tremendously harmful to the efforts to achieve peace, actual peace on the ground, and it wounds deeply. My own experience in Jerusalem, Jerusalem is a place that's very dear to my heart. I lived there for 2 years. I lived there at the height of the peace process from 92 to 94. I come at this as a completely secular person. I did not arrive in Jerusalem thinking, I'm coming home to the cradle of Judaism, to the cradle of my people. And yet, I know there's something special here. I remember we used to take, one of the things you do when you're serving in a place like Jerusalem, you spend a lot of time shepherding members of Congress and staff around when they come to visit, and a lot of those are to the religious sites. And I remember talking to a Franciscan monk about this, because I'm not religious, but you feel it. And he explained to me the idea, which it makes absolute sense to me, there's an accretion of faith in a place like Jerusalem. Even if you don't personally, I don't have any personal faith associated with it, for thousands of years, millions of people the world over have focused their faith on this place. It is a powerful, powerful thing, and you can't miss it. You feel it when you go to the Western Wall. I don't care if you're Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever, you feel it. You feel it when you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I went there with a friend of mine last time I visited, and she lit a candle for a cousin who has cancer. It is profound. And you feel it if you ever have the opportunity to go on the Haram al-Sharif. You go into the Dome of the Rock, and you can, I don't know how easy it is for non-Muslims to do this now, but when I was there you could. And there's a spot where you put your hand on an indentation in the rock where Muslims believe Muhammad's horse, it's the hoof print where he ascended to heaven. It is a powerful feeling, whether you buy that narrative or not. It is a powerful place. And the fact that these 3 religious narratives have coexisted, managed to coexist relatively peacefully for thousands of years, is in itself powerful. If you have not been, or even if you have been, next time you go, I would encourage you. Via Dolorosa, which most people, if you go now, I think they're surprised to find the Via Dolorosa is, souvenir shops and pizza places. But you can sit at a cafe at the right time of day, and you can watch the people go by. And then Via Dolorosa is the main thoroughfare for ultra-Orthodox Jews going to the Western Wall. And you'll see thousands of ultra-Orthodox Jews headed to the Western Wall. And if you sit there long enough, and you get there for prayer time for the Muslims, you will see thousands of Muslims headed along the same route. They turn off along the way to go to the Haram al-Sharif to make their prayers. And if you sit there at the right time of day, that is part way, and then you go up the hill to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I mean, it's all right there. And it is all managed to coexist in this remarkable way. And that coexistence is something that we have to preserve, or Jerusalem will not be Jerusalem. Not for Jews, not for Christians, not for Muslims. The good news that I would come to, and Danny and I spoke about this last night, and this is something that I have seen in my political lifetime of working this issue, which dates to the early 90s, is that today Israelis in general are closer to recognizing that less is more in Jerusalem. They are closer to recognizing that, or they have come a long way to recognizing that demanding Jewish exclusivity over the entire area, or Jewish predominance, is at odds with the tradition of religious, moral, ethical values of Judaism, of the State of Israel, and a very basic, what we would call a messianic value of tikkun olam, just trying to repair the world. It's a basic value in Judaism, making the world a better place, repairing what is wrong in the world. Israelis have come a long way on this. One has the sense that there has also been tremendous progress on the Palestinian Arab side, a recognition, if you look at not just the technical sense of how do we negotiate the details of this, but there is some growing recognition that if Islamic equities are to be preserved, the city is going to have to be shared. If Christian access and sites are to be preserved, the city has to be shared. This is not a zero-sum game, and it can't be for anyone. And that's a very positive thing. The sort of bad news, and it's not a new bad news, but when I sort of thought about this and I tried to sort of weigh these things, the bad news, the first bad news, is just a simple reality check. When I talk to Jews in the United States, even when I talk to my Israeli friends in Tel Aviv, when we talk about Jerusalem, we're generally talking about totally unrelated animals. The Jerusalem that I know is a living, breathing city full of mundane planning problems. It's got a horrible traffic problem. It's got all the issues with East Jerusalem, but it also has all the issues with West Jerusalem. Growing poverty. There's very little economic opportunity. The younger generation is fleeing the city. It is becoming more and more of an ultra-Orthodox city with all of the education and economic problems that go with a community that is very different and keeps itself apart. When you talk to Israelis who don't live in Jerusalem, they either dislike it because they sort of think of it in the terms of this isn't our city, or you talk to American Jews or American Christians, and probably Muslims to some extent in the rest of the world, and they have this idealized, almost Disneyland sense of Jerusalem, with this religious playground, and they identify seriously. I mean, I sometimes want to say, the people that you see in these pictures aren't hired to wear quaint costumes and hang out in the stalls for the tourists to see. This is actually their life. And you have to be able to somehow take that into account. And that isn't taken into account. When members of Congress weigh in with the, Jerusalem, the eternally united, undivided, never to be divided again capital of Jerusalem, I actually think their intentions are probably good. They're just talking about a Jerusalem that exists in movies or in a dream. It's not the Jerusalem of Israelis who want to have an actual capital recognized by the world, but don't actually care whether Abu Dis is part of that capital, and certainly would prefer that the people in Abu Dis are not plunged into such poverty that they're going to be committing attacks against Israelis. This is the reality of a functioning city, and it's very mundane, and it's very hard to get people to focus on. We used to see, when I was living in Jerusalem, at the consulate, you'd see these people arrive and kind of go into shock, because Jerusalem is not what they expect. They really did expect a theme park, and it is very, very far from a theme park. The other bad news is something which all of us who follow this issue are quite familiar with, and it is it's extremism. And it is Jewish extremists, it is Christian extremists, and it's Muslim extremists, sometimes working in tandem. There is a desire. Jerusalem is a place that attracts and acts as a petri dish almost for some of the most extreme impulses of people to say, my narrative and none other. Your narrative is illegitimate. Let me use whatever power I have, moral, financial, whatever it takes to erase, to eradicate, to deny your narrative. And it's a terrible problem. And it's something that, for me, when I talk to Christian groups, particularly Christians who are supportive of Israel, I think it's so, I become troubled by the sense that Christian Zionism has become, for many of us, a loaded term. I would love for Christian Zionism to be about keeping Israel safe, secure, stable, a state that can exist well into the future. I don't want it to be about hastening the coming of the apocalypse. And I don't want it to be about helping the most divisive elements in Israeli and Jewish society foment problems in the city that I love so much. Some basic statements, which I think have to be sort of just thrown out there. They seem obvious, but I think they're worth saying, and I'm actually going to read them so I don't forget. The sides completely mistrust each other on the ground. When we work on Jerusalem, we try to come up with plans, with ideas to bridge. There is no trust in the intentions of the other side. So any action taken by one side is laden with suspicion, with guilt, with mistrust. As I've said, each side has within it, to some degree, elements which aspire to destroy, to wipe out the narrative of, to establish the supremacy of their own side over that of the other. Another simple observation: the imbalance of power actually works to strengthen this mistrust, and it creates an incentive on one side and a disincentive on the other, either to create mischief or to avoid taking steps that would create problems. So with this great imbalance of power, you have the more powerful party saying, it's not a big deal, we can do this and no one's going to do anything about it. And you have the weaker party saying, we're weaker, we can take whatever steps we need. We have a right to use whatever means are available because we have little power. On the very simple observational level, and this is something that people like Danny work with every day, even when you can find people of good faith, people who want to find solutions, there are no good channels left between the parties on the ground to try to resolve problems, to try to build trust, to try to get around these things. Earlier on, in the 90s, we had channels of communication between the Israelis who ran things on the ground and Orient House, Faisal Husseini. You had informal communications that kept things from really spilling out of control. That doesn't exist anymore, and it seems improbable that it's going to be recreated anytime soon based on the situation on the ground. Another thing that's just so obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. The Old City, and in particular the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, are especially explosive. I know I'm speaking to a Christian audience. The fact is, there are not the same claims over the Christian sites in the Holy City where you have a constant powder keg. And that's very fortunate for the Christian sites, because otherwise it would be even uglier. The situation, when you look at what happened with, for instance, the Mughrabi Gate excavation in January, where you have something that really should be pretty mundane. You need an access ramp, and it's instantly not mundane, partly because of all the mistrust, the bad communication, the no channels for resolving things, and partly because of the imbalance of power, where one side says, I can pretty much do what I want, and the other side immediately moves to the accusations of the worst intentions and denying the other's right to be there at all. It goes absolutely to the extreme. The saddest part of this stream of logic, each side, and I will say all sides because this is Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and it's Israeli-Palestinian, everybody understands the sensitivities associated with Jerusalem. Everyone understands it. And there are elements on all sides that are more than happy to manipulate Jerusalem. And it is at the cost of the people living on the ground. That is the reality. It is at the immediate cost of Israelis and Palestinians who live in this city. Again, it's not a theme park. There's the competing desire to maintain the city as a symbol for the world and for all that it means. and to maintain it as a city that people live in. And when the sides manipulate Jerusalem, and everyone does it, it is to the detriment of the people who live there. I will close with, I will actually read this, a Danny Seidemann quote, because I think it's really good. Danny always says, Jerusalem has the undeserved reputation for being nitroglycerin, where any random bump in the road will set it off. In reality, Jerusalem's millennia-old history is one of stability and the peaceful, if uneasy cohabitation of conflicting narratives. There's a short list of very specific phenomena that can destabilize the city, and that list includes not only things like things actually happening on the Dome of the Rock, Haram al-Sharif, Wailing Wall area, but cutting off access, making it impossible for people to move. This is a short list, and that list, when those things happen, it can cause a conflagration that extends well beyond the Old City and well beyond Jerusalem into the region. This is what we have to focus on. And the biggest concern for those of us who care about Jerusalem and the future of Jerusalem and care about Israel, looking at this today, is that one has the sense at this time of regional instability, of regional tension, of a growing real or created clash between religious narratives, that this conflict between Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, Christians is being simmered down to a core. Danny talks about the volcanic core, which is the holy sites in the Old City. So you move to issues of not granting sufficient access. Today, right now, the only Muslims who can get to the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem are Arab Israeli men and Palestinian men who have permits over the age usually of 40, I believe. So Friday prayers, that's it. For the entire world of Islam, those are the only people who can get there. For Christian holidays, you cannot make the pilgrimage between the Christian holy sites in the West Bank and Jerusalem and Nazareth without passing through umpteen checkpoints. It is not possible. Christian Palestinians can't do it at all unless they have special permits. It is a sense that at this time of real tension, we're actually heightening the situation by focusing it on probably the most explosive element. And as I said before, for going back to the theme of this workshop, which is the Jewish-Israeli connection, Jews and Israelis would not be Jews and Israelis without Jerusalem, but Jerusalem would not be Jerusalem without the Muslim and Christian narratives existing there as well. And we have to fight to preserve that.